Hi, welcome to the channel. I've decided to expand again, this time to include some interviews. And I thought I would try interviews with famous scientists. And I'm delighted that Professor Humphrey Rang, who produced the Rang and Dale Pharmacology textbook, agreed to meet me a few weeks ago over Zoom and just have a chat and answer some questions in which we talk about receptors and receptor distribution. So this should be of interest to any student of pharmacology or anybody really who's interested in drugs, how drugs work, and the action of receptors. So I hope you enjoy this. Okay, well, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Humphrey Rang onto the channel today. Thanks very much, Humphrey, for coming along and making the time to speak to me. What I'm intending to do with this series of interviews is really just speak to scientists that I've met over the years, and ask them about what their general interest in science is, and try and touch on some current topics. So for those of us who study pharmacology, or anybody who's ever been involved in the world of pharmacology, they'll know of you and of the Rang and Dale textbook. But for those people who perhaps don't know anything about pharmacology or receptors or drugs, perhaps you could start just by introducing yourself, who you are, how you got involved in science and pharmacology, and basically what your scientific interests are.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. It's a pleasure to be here. I started out reading medicine at University College and qualified in medicine from there. But on the way, I was extremely enthused by physiology and pharmacology in particular, because the head of pharmacology at that time, this was in the mid-50s, was Heinz Schild, whose name is well known to pharmacologists for his excellent and really seminal work on receptor mechanisms. He introduced quantitative methods to pharmacology in a way that was really quite rare at the time. It tended to be very focused on phenomenology rather than measurement. And he was very keen on measurement. And I did practical classes in his course. I did a BSc on the way through medicine, and we had an excellent pharmacology module run by Heinz Schild. And I got to know him really quite well at that time and really admired his approaches. They were based on work that A.J. Clarke had really initiated in quantitative pharmacology. An Edinburgh man will be disappointed. So anyway, I went through this course, and that was all fine. And then I started on clinical medicine. And what struck me very much when I first was introduced to patients on wards was there was a real mismatch, I felt, between a huge amount of physiological and pharmacological knowledge about homeostatic mechanisms and the way drugs could affect them and so on, and the very limited therapeutic potential of the drugs that were currently available. I particularly remember an elderly Jewish gentleman, a refugee from the Nazis, who was desperately ill in hospital with what was then known as malignant hypertension. It was extremely high blood pressure with a whole lot of complications ensuing from that, which he had in large number. And he was dying, and the professor of medicine told me that he was unlikely to live for more than another week or two. in his condition. And there was really very little therapeutically that could be done, despite everything that we knew about how blood pressure was regulated and how the autonomic nervous system worked in relation to controlling blood pressure. And I was very struck by this mismatch between what we knew about controlling blood pressure and the actual capabilities that we had to manipulate that therapeutically. And this all sounds a little bit corny, I know, but as I went through the clinical course, I was struck again and again by what I felt was the potential of drugs to produce therapeutic benefit and the very limited ways in which they were then used. This you'll realize was 60 years ago, and things have changed dramatically in the interim. It certainly struck me at that time. And so when I finished and qualified in medicine, rather than going into clinical medicine, I decided to stay in pharmacological research. I was then able to take up a fellowship in the pharmacology department in Oxford, which was really a brilliant experience.
It is. It's amazing to think that, 60 years, okay, it does sound like a long time ago, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not that long ago that, as you said, that having malignant hypertension was a death sentence.
Yes.
And yet today we have drugs that, well, the GP can bring your blood pressure down to pretty much whatever they want it to be.
Yes.
So that's really that's a real success story, I suppose, for the drug industry and for pharmacology.
Well, it is, and of course there are many other success stories as well. I mean, the therapeutic possibilities at the moment are just out of range of anything that we could even think about.
And it was interesting you said there about we knew a lot about blood pressure, but we didn't have the medicine. But obviously, if you're working with Schild, what was it, 56 or something, that the paper on where all the Schild plots and his work on in quantitative pharmacology. So we, at that time, probably quite a lot was known about drugs, but as I don't remember, but I was imagine at that time the receptor was a sort of hypothetical, theoretical thing. So that was amazing that we still teach about Schild plots and the theory of drugs, and yet all of that was based on really quite hypothetical theory about what receptors were.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the concept of receptors really stems from Langley in 1905. And interestingly, the first quantitative approach to it came from one of his students in Cambridge, A.V. Hill, who then went on to win a Nobel Prize. But A.V. Hill actually published a paper in 1909, which very seldom gets referred to nowadays, but it was actually the beginning of applying very simple chemical principles to the interaction of drugs with receptors. And he really opened the door to this approach. It was taken up later and more extensively by Clarke and Gaddum and then further on by Schild and others. So it has long roots, the receptor idea, but as you just said, it remained completely abstract. It was just a matter of terms in equations up until the mid-60s.
Yeah, it makes the work of those early pharmacologists all the more impressive. And so maybe one question that kind of follows on from that is that I've found, probably as I've got a little bit older, I find it really interesting going back and reading the old papers and seeing what was what was understood at that time. And so I often in the lectures that I do, I'll put a lot of the history in as much as I can remember. But I'm never entirely convinced whether or not the students are that interested in the history, or they just want to know, what do we know now? Do you think, is there a value for students to go back and read those old papers from the 50s and earlier?
I don't know. I've been out of teaching for too many years to really have much insight into the student mind at the moment. I mean, I'm not sure. I think what is absolutely essential is to understand something about how the evidence was obtained to support the views we now hold. It's so easy to read a textbook and say, well, this is how it is. We know it's this, and we know there's that box that communicates with this box, and you can draw a little diagram of it all, and that's the story. Without any appreciation of how that story actually came into being, and more importantly, the fact that that story is continually being modified by new experimental evidence.
Yeah.
And just keeping the connect between the evidence and the currently accepted hypothesis, I think is really important, particularly in medicine, which is changing all the time. And doctors need to realize that it's changing by dint of a huge amount of research work going on in the background, producing new experimental evidence. It doesn't just happen.
Yeah.
Get plonked on.
Yeah. That's a good point. And so if I could bring you back to the paper that you published 2006, and this is a paper that I use. It's probably, I would use it on the first week of all tutorials. And the title of the paper was Receptor Theory, Pharmacology's Big Idea.
Yeah.
And I love that paper because of the history in it, but also because of one quote that I remember. I don't know if you remember everything you wrote in that paper, but you say something along the lines of that the receptor theory as a term or receptor theory is a term that you hope will be consigned to the waste bin. What did you mean by that?
What I meant was that the early ideas of Clarke and Gaddum and Schild, which we've already just touched upon, were based on a very, very simple model relating the occupation of a particular receptor to the production of an effect or the blocking effect. And you can see that as a simple one-step process, maybe, or rather a two-step process. There's a binding, then there's receptor activation, which produces something. And that's fine. That very simple linear system is fine as a starting point. But the more we learn about receptors and how they work, the more inadequate that kind of formulation seems to be. And people have, over the years, extended it to produce far more states. Originally there was the occupied state and the activated state. And now we've got a whole slew of other states to account for desensitization, activation in different ways, activation of the same receptor in different ways by different agonists, and so on. And all this is well documented evidence of how receptors work in the real world. And so I find that this focus on just this over-simple mass action model, it's really time to move on from that. And I think that the people working in the field have indeed moved on from it, a long way off from it. And so, as far as students are concerned, I mean, in a sense, it's very helpful to start by talking about the very simple model. But it soon becomes so overcomplicated. And I suppose I don't think receptor theory has got any bounds really. It's practical experimental evidence that takes you forward, not elaborating on complicated mechanisms.
Yeah, it's interesting. And so that kind of brings us on nicely then to receptors and the distribution of receptors, which is a thing that I've become interested in over the years, and particularly thinking about even in a tissue where you have two cells side by side, like two smooth muscle cells side by side, could have completely different complements of receptors or quite different expressions of receptors. And so we spent quite a bit of time with Ian McGrath looking at receptor distribution using fluorescent drugs. And in that 2006 paper, you show that the figure by Vassar was a diaphragm, I think, of nicotinic receptors. So what I think we would regard as being possibly the first ever image of receptor distribution. And I'm aware that you worked with Bill Payton on muscarinic receptors, and I'm curious about why you put that image in the 2006 paper and how it relates to the work that you were doing soon after that period.
I think that study by Vassar's group, which there were several papers published in the late 50s and early 60s using autoradiography to pick out the distribution of nicotinic receptors in various tissues. And it for me, it just indicated that there was a reality. It wasn't just this theoretical construct. And that was, Bill Payton was a very interesting and clever pharmacologist, and he'd made some contributions to theories of drug action and so on, which were very much the topic of discussion in Oxford at that time. And it so happened at that time that the Radiochemical Centre in Amersham started advertising a service where they would attach tritium to any molecule, any compound that you sent them. So Bill suggested one morning, why don't we try labelling actually with tritium in that way and see if we can use it to identify receptors in intestinal smooth muscle, which was a kind of the quantitative pharmacologist's preparation of choice at that particular time. So we did that, and that was the basis of the work we published in 1965 on the binding of atropine in intestinal smooth muscle. And we produced a lot of evidence that we were actually looking at receptor binding pharmacological evidence. And so this I think was one of the first, I probably was the first published binding study to look at receptor binding directly. And that was very important to me. First of all, it indicated that the number of receptors in tissues was, in this tissue area, was really very small. It was only a fraction of a percent of the membrane surface that could be covered by receptors. So, and we actually tried to interest the biochemists in Oxford in a project to identify this binding material. They turned up their noses and said, "There's much little for us to possibly work on." So we made a few attempts that didn't work to isolate and characterize the receptor substance. We didn't even know that it was a protein. We thought it was most likely to be a but we certainly have no evidence to support it.
And those autoradiography experiments, of course, they would take days, wouldn't they? Or was it weeks? I've never really done those experiments myself, but I presume you stick it away in a cupboard, and
yeah,
how long do you have to wait before you you get the answer?
No, I wouldn't have liked to be part of research student.
So,
and it's only very roughly quantitative. It's, you can't really make decent measurements. But just showing that the receptors were distributed exactly where we knew that in physiological experiments they ought to be, was really very telling.
So let me ask you just what related to that then. So you were looking at then the distribution of muscarinic receptors on smooth muscle of the ilium or ilium,
yeah,
which presumably would have circular and longitudinal muscle. Did you find, and was what you saw what you expected?
It was the equilibrium measurements that we made. You know, we measured the rate of uptake of aspirin under various conditions and so on. The equilibrium measurements all worked out pretty well with the measured affinity constants in this tissue measured pharmacologically. The kinetics was all over the place.
Right.
And Bill Payton and I were particularly interested in kinetics at that stage because of some of his kinetic ideas about flux acting. But what became clear was that we were not looking directly at the binding and unbinding kinetics, the K1, K- of the receptor interaction. We were looking at the rates of uptake were largely diffusion limited to just an idea. So we still didn't know much about the kinetics, but the equilibrium measurements worked out really pretty well. And that has subsequently become a pretty standard laboratory practice, kind of thing that took me 2 years to sort out as the kind of thing you do on a wet Friday afternoon.
Yeah. And so, and distribution of receptors is still something that I think that we're still a mystery, you know, and why there are so many subtypes and why they're distributed in a particular way. And that kind of brings me on nicely to something that's a bit more up to date. And a lot of people will now have heard of ACE2 because of the COVID particle binding to ACE2. And you know, I've read a lot of literature which refers to ACE2 as a receptor, whereas I've not really thought of. I've thought, okay, it's a converting enzyme. You know, it takes angiotensin 2 and cleaves it, but I hadn't really thought of it as an enzyme, as a receptor. And then it's made me think about the distribution of ACE2 and why some patients are hit really hard by the SARS-CoV-2 virus and others not so much. And I was wondering, is that perhaps about the distribution of the enzyme, let's call it a receptor? And I think that's made me think about a real life situation at the moment where receptor distribution really can be a matter of life or death. And I wonder what are your thoughts in general about receptor distribution and the study of that?
Well, yes, I mean the ACE2 story, you know a lot more about it than I do. But for one thing, it focuses on a kind of an ambiguity between what we mean by a receptor and what is an enzyme. And I think increasingly we're finding that receptors, as well as recognizing and responding to the appearance of a particular ligand, can do all kinds of other things as well. This is just the nature of evolution, which means that a particular protein structure gets exploited for whatever properties it possesses, whether we call it a receptor or something else is not really relevant. The point you raise about receptor distribution and indeed the enormous multiplication of receptor types that have emerged from cloning studies, basically. I think this really has become very impressive. And sorry, I'm rambling a little bit here, I realize. But the receptor distribution within a cell, I mean, it was obvious from the early days of neuromuscular junctions that the receptors were focused on, they were present just at the end plate region of the striated muscle and not elsewhere on the fiber. Even Langley knew this perfectly well. So we've got to consider not only, we mustn't consider cells as just uniform blobs with receptors on the surface and a homogeneous interior. They are little cities in themselves with enormously complicated microstructures, including the particular distribution of receptors, which is clearly closely related to the position at which they're likely to encounter the transmitter or hormone molecule. So we've got to consider the whole area of what controls the expression of receptors in the first place and the location of receptors within the cell, not only the receptors, but the whole transduction machinery is also localized in very selective ways within the cell. So in a way, you know, whereas we're used to thinking of the organism as the complicated responding system that matters to us as individuals, a cell is just as complicated as an organism.
Sure. That actually reminds me of something and brings me to one of the last questions. I told you one time, and you didn't believe me, that myself and Dorothy have a copy of the textbook in our bedroom. Right? Why would you have a copy of Rang and Dale in your bedroom? But she reminded me last night of her favourite quote from the book, in which you say that without receptors, we would be no more than a bucket of amoeba.
Yeah.
Whatever brought that to your mind? It's a wonderful analogy. It's very visual. What were you thinking?
Well, it stems from a lot of discussions with Bill Payton. Bill always argued that pharmacology was really a study of chemical communication, and the way we have the structure and the function that we possess as individuals is all because our cells communicate with each other. And that's where the bucket of amoeba analogy comes from. Because, well, probably, for all I know, buckets of amoeba, they do communicate with each other. They don't do it in anything like the effective way that the bucket of cells that constitutes it.
So that was certainly in the first edition of the book. I have to confess, I don't know where we are with edition 8 or 9. Does that still survive? And does the hexamethonium man from Bill Payton's 54 paper, does that still survive in the book today?
I'll have to look, I'm afraid, because I only have a rather not remote, but down the line. I don't do any of the writing anymore. So I'm not sure. I think probably hexamethonium man did disappear 2 or 3 years ago, because the publishers constantly tell us to keep it short and cut out anything that's not relevant to students passing their exams. And we react as strongly as possible to this invocation, but I think nonetheless some things have had to been abandoned. I don't know about the bucket of movie.
Should check. It should certainly be in there. I know that Dorothy will be really disappointed if that's gone from the book. So where are we with the book now? What edition and what involvement do you have?
Well, the 9th edition came out about a year ago, just over a year ago. I did a lot of overall editing and ticking authors off, saying things that I thought were inconsistent with what somebody else was saying, somebody else or wasn't clear. And so that's my last shot at it. I've been living with that book for 35 years now.
Well, yeah. Oh, it's an absolute must-have for any pharmacologist, no doubt.
Yeah.
Well, Humphrey, thanks very much. It's been great to catch up with you again, and thanks for your insight. This is the first in a series, hopefully, of just speaking to pharmacologists or scientists about the thing that they love the most. And well, thank you once again for coming along.
It's been a real pleasure, and thank you for doing it, Craig. I think you're doing a really, really good job. Maybe we'll go sailing together.
Oh, I would love that. And hopefully maybe see you at the next pharmacological meeting. Presumably it'll be online. But
yes. Yeah, I mentioned it will. Yeah.
Who knows? But hopefully we'll catch up in person sometime.
It's been a real pleasure, Craig.
Thanks very much, Humphrey. I really appreciate it.
With your YouTube.
Who knows how it might go.
Okay, good.
Okay.
See you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye.